All right, so we've talked about anthropogenic radiative forcing, but humans aren't the only thing that are contributing heat to Earth. So we have to look at natural forcing as well. The first thing we're going to look at is just solar irradiance, right? The sun goes through cycles where sometimes it's emitting more radiation than other times, and these are just natural cycles. And if we plot these natural cycles over the time of observations, we see that recently the total solar irradiance is in a minimum, right? Where it's actually decreasing. However, we know that the temperature on Earth is not decreasing with the total solar irradiance. That is telling us that the amount of heat humans are adding to our atmosphere due to greenhouse gases has overwhelmed the signal of the sun, right? The natural cycle of the sun is irrelevant to modern climate change. They're no longer following the same pattern because of the huge impacts of humans. All right, the sun is not the only thing that adds radiative forcing to Earth. We also have to think of other things such as volcanoes. Volcanoes add a ton of aerosols and greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. Aerosols, as we know, have a cooling effect. Greenhouse gases have a warming effect. Because aerosols stay in the atmosphere for a shorter period of time, they tend to fall out after just a couple years. After a big volcanic eruption, we often notice a brief period of cooling for just a couple years, and that is preceded by a longer period of warming. So if you look at this graph, you can see that since the 1960s, we have seen 3 major volcanic eruptions, and after each one, there was cooling, about 1/4 degree Celsius cooling. Now, this means that there's very high confidence that industrial era natural forcing is a small fraction of the anthropogenic forcing, except for brief periods following large volcanic eruptions, right? We know that total solar irradiance isn't really affecting our climate right now because the anthropogenic signal just totally overwhelms it. And really the only natural forcing that we see imprinted on the anthropogenic signal is that of volcanoes, but it only lasts for a couple years after a big volcanic eruption. So let's think of the most recent big volcanic eruption that we can. You might be thinking of the Hunga Tunga Hunga Ha'apai eruption that happened in January of 2022. I'm going to call it the Tunga eruption from now on for simplicity. And during this eruption, both SO2, sulfur dioxide, and water vapor were released into the atmosphere. We know that SO2 has a cooling effect when this aerosol is in the high atmosphere. And when this volcano first erupted, we thought there was going to be so much SO2 released into the atmosphere. And then afterwards, when we looked at the observations, scientists realized, oh, there really wasn't much emitted. There was really only 0.4 million tons of sulfur dioxide, which might sound like a lot, but when you think about the possible temperature reduction that it could cause, it was only 0.004 degrees Celsius that might be caused by that. So basically imperceivable. Right? For comparison, the 1991 Mount Pinatubo eruption released 15 million tons of sulfur dioxide, and it did reduce the temperature by about 1/4 degree for a couple years. So this eruption did not have a strong cooling effect on the planet. However, it did have a strong warming effect on the planet. And that's because it didn't just release SO2, it also released water vapor. And that water vapor was blasted high into the atmosphere, creating these high elevation clouds. And we know, or high altitude clouds, and we know that high altitude clouds have a net warming impact. The amount of water that was released into the atmosphere was just enormous. And it's because the Hunga Tunga Hunga Ha'apai volcano is a underwater volcano, a volcanic island. So when it erupted, it blasted that seawater out into the atmosphere, 58,000 Olympic swimming pools worth of water. That's 4 times greater than how much was erupted from Mount Pinatubo. Right. So since the water vapor is high in the atmosphere, it has a net warming effect. We do expect to see an increase in global warming due to this volcano in the near future.